Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Rector Yanni, thank you very much for the invitation. It's good to be here, good to be speaking, even if at a kind of sort of depressing time to be considering Russia's role. What I'm going to be doing is talking for about 45 to 50 minutes. Then I'd very much like to throw the floor open to question, but also discussion, because precisely this is an opportunity to talk about some of the issues concerned. Given precisely the quality of the panelists speaking, what I'm going to be doing is really trying to sort of set the scene, covering a wide range of issues. And when I was sort of looking at the title, Russia and the Return of Geopolitics, well, one of the issues we can discuss is whether it's a return or whether it's something new. What I want to do, though, is to talk a little bit about the sources of Russian activity, the capabilities, the tactics, and then to try and look to the future and begin to actually get some sense of where we might be going. And a pretty central theme of actually how I look at what's going on at the moment is the arrival of what I call guerrilla geopolitics, which is rooted in a simple conundrum, a simple challenge. Russia has extremely ambitious goals for itself. Russia, in many ways, is trying to reshape not just its own neighborhood, not just Europe, but in many ways the whole global security and geopolitical architecture. And yet it's trying to do that as a relatively weak power. It has the memories of superpower status, but not the capacities. And what over time has evolved has been precisely this form of, shall I say, political asymmetric warfare. So that's my basic thesis, that Russia's current regime has come to realize that its aims cannot either be accommodated fully through the present international order, nor be forced on that order by conventional methods. So it's built on time-honored practices to develop a new doctrine, one based on multiple, ambiguous, and parallel pressures, leveraging Russia's strengths and its rivals, i.e. our weaknesses. And really what I want to do is actually pick up on a variety of the phrases in that basic, I'll call it a thesis, it makes it sound much more scientific, that basic sort of perspective. To start with the thing, I see Russia's current regime. It's very easy to fall back on assumptions about, well, the Russians are like that they have some kind of imperialist DNA or whatever, and that's understandable, not in the least of the sort of Tsarist and Soviet experiences or whatever. But I think we have to be very clear about the extent to which what we're talking about is very much rooted in the current regime in the Kremlin. And even when we talk about that, it's important to stress that Putin today is not the same, in my opinion, as the Putin we saw during his first two presidential terms. So when we look at, shall I say, old Putin, we see someone who, of course, mobilized the rhetoric of nationalism very extensively and effectively, and who clearly was a Russian nationalist. But nonetheless, he also saw Russia's future as being, to a considerable extent, dependent on its capacity to integrate with, on its own terms, integrate with the Western world, the outside world. He used the language of nationalism, but he never allowed it to constrain his policy options. He could basically turn it on and turn it off when it was needful. I think we see that nowadays, though, a rather different Putin. One for whom nationalism is not just simply an instrument, but actually central to what he regards as his role in the Kremlin. This is a man who, and it's always dangerous to sort of believe his rhetoric sometimes, but I think my feeling is that this is a man who actually has come to believe his own language, come to believe that he has this essentially fundamental and indispensable role in saving Russia. Not just in holding it together. In some ways, his first two terms were about saving Russia from its internal fragmenting impulses after the terrible 1990s. Well, now it's saving Russia from external forces. And that is obviously a much more sort of challenging issue. It's also, I would suggest, a view that is based on increasing ignorance about the outside world. I spent the first 7.5 months of this year in Moscow. And one of the things I was doing while I was there was precisely trying to get to talk to people who might actually have some kind of traction on Putin's own thinking. And the fascinating thing was the extent to which people who I once would have expected to have had a role, who would have perhaps briefed him or written papers that were meant for his inner circle or whatever, increasingly were saying, we have no idea. We do not know what Putin knows. We do not know what Putin thinks, because we're doing the same as everyone else. All we get to do is watch television and listen to his speeches. Even people who are in the foreign ministry, even people who are within the general staff, clearly felt a growing alienation from the policy-making process. And again, this is just passing on what I heard, but someone I knew who had literally just a few weeks earlier retired from the General Staff's main operations directorate. In other words, its main planning and think tank element. He's someone I've known for years, and he's someone who I plied with lots of alcohol, which is the researcher's best friend. And he was saying that before the final decision was made about Crimea, they were already expecting a call to come and give a final briefing to the president or president's inner circle. They had their PowerPoints already and so forth. They were never called. Just the word came out, we're taking Crimea. So even people within the general staff are not now being brought into the discussions. Likewise, conversations I had with people in the foreign ministry made it very clear the extent to which they were just basically expected to just do what they're told. They were not involved in conversation. So I think this is the thing. We now have a Putin who, let's face it, is very, very rarely even in the Kremlin. He doesn't go into Moscow anymore, except when he really has to. He stays at his palatial dacha outside the city and summons people to talk to him when he wants. This is a man who has isolated himself from many of the people who, once upon a time, could tell him the hard truths. The kind of people who could say no to him. Now, okay, we expect that. Authoritarian leaders tend, over time, to retreat from people who are uncomfortable for them. And that's what we've seen with Putin. So I think this is a very definite, sort of very worrying development that we have seen. And it's a Kremlin that's having to deal with new uncertainties, even before the way things have sped up in 2014. And particularly Putin himself is trying to come to terms. And here I'm wandering into the realms of amateur psychotherapy, for which I apologize. We cannot know what Putin thinks. We cannot know why Putin thinks what he thinks. We can just guess. So these are, treat them with caution, my guesses at some of the factors that are coming to bear. One is just simply issues of mortality. He's getting older. He's beginning to think much more about, well, what will his legacy be? And I think it's clear that he really wants to go down in history as one of the great Russian leaders. And his changing sense of quite what that means is important. And I'll come on to the whole issues of quite what Putin wants for Russia later on. The economy. Even before the current dip in oil prices and even before the new sanctions regime, it was clear that Russia's economy was heading for some problems. And that, again, is a fundamental political issue, because so much of Putin's political legitimacy has been based on two social contracts. A social contract with the Russian people, which says basically, you just stay out of politics, you let me run the country, and your quality of life will be better than it has ever been in your memories. And that's perfectly true. Moscow is not a typical Russian city, but nonetheless Moscow is a tremendously exciting and fun place now. Not a phrase I would ever have expected to have said in my life. Russians themselves now, until recently, have been living better than ever before. But that costs money. And perhaps most importantly, though, there's a second social contract, a social contract with the Russian elite, which is basically likewise, look, you support and bolster the system, and you can live very good lives. steal by all means. Steal up to the appropriate amount for your level. And then spend it on your dachas and on your trips abroad and everything else, or your luxury cars, you name it. Support the system and this will be preserved and protected. And again, that costs money. And so when the economy begins to go downhill, that puts serious pressure on the social contract. And so maybe you need to look for other ways of basically building the legitimacy of your regime. And that's another way in which nationalism crops up, as a way of saying, well, okay, times are hard, but nonetheless you must support the regime because we're doing something great for Russia. So he has to shore up his support within the masses, but perhaps most importantly within the elite. And also geopolitical uncertainties. I mean, I think it's clear that in fact the world is shifting in ways that are not comfortable for Russia. The rise of China, however much at the moment Russia is trying to use China as a sort of a counterweight to the West, is also a deeply disquieting phenomenon for a Russian regime that sees that in fact China is a rival in Asia, that is worried about the extent to which Chinese money and Chinese migration might begin to be reshaping the Russian Far East. So for all these reasons, the world in 2014, at the beginning of 2014, was beginning to look like a dangerous and worrying place for Putin. And Putin's natural instincts, in my opinion, are precisely to, in those circumstances, to strike out. Not to just try and weather the storm, but to try and reshape the world around him. Which raises the question, okay, so what is it that he wants? Well, to an extent, it can be sort of brought down to this amorphous term of respect. It's clearly important for him that Russia is respected. There is a constant leitmotif, this theme that emerges of that sense that Russia is being treated badly, treated unfairly. And that also works for him. It's quite interesting, his early departure from the G20 summit in Australia. I think in part that was a political move, but also it's in part because he genuinely felt that he was not being treated properly as the president of the great Russia. But far more importantly than all of these is this concept of sovereignty. Russian sovereignty as Putin understands it, that I think is absolutely central to understanding what Russian policy is all about. His notion of sovereignty is basically one which means freedom, his own kind of freedom for his own kind of people. It's freedom to basically be able to rule Russia in peace. How dare the outside world feel that it can speak to Russia and tell the Kremlin how it can rule Russia? How dare the outside world seek to infringe on the capacity to, let's put it bluntly, oppress non-government organizations that give the wrong message? How dare the outside world try to tell Russia how it should protect intellectual property for software, for products and so forth that are produced elsewhere? I think he very, very clearly has this sense that it is not anybody else's job to tell the Kremlin how to rule Russia. More generally, it's sovereignty of Russia to be able to do what he thinks is appropriate, which particularly means assert its control over its sphere of influence in Eurasia. The fact of the matter is that Russia believes that it has a historic and geostrategic right to intervene in countries such as Ukraine, such as Georgia. And they inevitably say, well, what about the American Monroe Doctrine? What about the West interfering in North Africa and the Middle East and so forth? And it has to be said that the West is not always entirely disinterested and moral in its actions. It's fine. But that doesn't actually explain away or rationalize what Russia has done, particularly in Ukraine. But again, that doesn't matter. That's precisely the kind of Western moralization that Putin wants to protect Russia from. I think this is a point I'm going to be coming back to time and again. In Putin's mind, Putin is a defender of Russia. He is a defender of Russian interests. But he just feels that Russian interests nonetheless ought to have a greater priority within Eurasia. And every time we turn around and say, well, no, actually, international law says that you can't just simply seize the Crimea, even if you've run some more than slightly bogus referendum in there. You can't just simply take it. Likewise, actually no, Ukraine is a legitimate state with legitimate borders, and therefore what you're doing in eastern Ukraine is actually a violation of that. Well, as far as he's concerned, that is not the West standing up for international law. That is the West interfering with Russian legitimate interests. Now, I should stress, I'm not in any way supporting those views, but I think it is really important to consider that. But it also means that actually Putin cannot accept half measures. It worries me in a way, because it makes me feel as if I'm being particularly hawkish. But the thing that strikes me is how little scope I feel there is for negotiation in the current status quo. This is not, I think, what is happening in Luhansk and Donetsk is not, in my opinion, because Putin wants to annex impoverished coal mining regions of Ukraine. Not at all. It's because he wants to use those as means of bringing pressure to bear upon Kiev. He wants to make Kiev bow to Russian interests. So, as it were, there is negotiation there, though the negotiation means essentially accepting Russia's demands. But more generally, his concept of sovereignty, his refusal, in my opinion, to acknowledge the sovereignty of others when it possibly conflicts with Russian interests, these are not negotiable terms. He genuinely wants, in some ways, to take Russia out of the international order. I mean, I've sometimes, slightly tongue-in-cheek, described this as the North Koreanization of Russia. It's not that he wants to bring Russia out of the financial systems and so forth. I mean, he understands that Russia's prosperity depends on export of hydrocarbons, import of technologies, bringing in foreign credits and so forth. But even those he wants very much on his own terms. But basically, Putin wants to be able to determine Russia's relationship with the rest of the world and shape it in Russia's interests. And also, I mean, his character and domestic political considerations mean that there's actually very little scope for half measures, for negotiations. I honestly don't know how this will play out, except, and I'll come to this at the end, that I do think that Putin's actions in 2014 have ensured that Putin has doomed himself politically and have brought forward the end of his regime. But I'll come to that later. Example, there's really very little room in the status quo for his kind of Russia. NATO, which was undoubtedly in a situation in which it wasn't really sure what its future role would be, is now galvanized and now knows once again that its future role is the same as its past role. It is protecting the West against Russia, a different kind of threat, a different kind of Russia, but nonetheless that. Central Asia and the Caucasus are contested regions. I mean, these are areas that Russia regards as part of its sphere of influence, but in fact, these are also areas in which a variety of other powers are interested. And more to the point, the local nations, even while they may pay lip service to Moscow's desire to be the regional hegemon, the regional controller, are looking to basically leverage their position. If you look in Central Asia, the Moscow-Beijing competition, sometimes Moscow-Beijing-Washington, is very striking. The extent to which actually China is quietly, in the way that China tends to, but nonetheless is looking increasingly to basically challenge Moscow's hegemony over the region. Likewise, if one looks at Central Asia, the Caucasus, there's a variety of other actors. When I was in Baku, it was quite striking to me the extent to which you found Turkish military and police advisors, Israelis, and others, as well as the anticipated Westerners and Russians, all there trying to make their connections and so forth, and the Azeris gladly playing off one party against the other. These are not victims, these countries. They know they are in the shadow of Moscow, and they know that they have to somehow accommodate Moscow, but nonetheless they are looking to see how they can maximize their own conditions. Moscow's grip over these countries is really quite, I would say, limited. Moscow's ambitions entirely sort of collide with international law and a concept of sovereignty, and a whole variety of different institutions that they've been flouting of late. The European Court of Human Rights, for a long time, has been identifying human rights abuses in Russia. Obviously, we particularly saw it with the war in Chechnya, and in turn being denounced by Moscow as an agent of foreign influence. Organisations such as the WTO, the World Trade Organization, or the G20 body. The 1997 Russo-Ukrainian Treaty of Friendship. Again, its terms have been entirely violated by what's been going on in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. So time and time again, what Russia is doing is basically flouting international law and flouting the standards that it itself had once upon a time sought to develop. I mean, Russia has had an interesting relationship with, for example, the United Nations. That in many ways, Russia has actually been quite an effective member of the United Nations, and not just purely for self-interested purposes. But increasingly, it sees the United Nations as a spoiler, as an organisation it can use to flout other groups or whatever. But, as I said, although it has these grand aspirations, we have to appreciate just how limited a power Russia really is. You know, that is usually the sort of expectation, the understanding that you have. You know, poor little Obama and his teddy bear against big bad action man Vladimir Putin and his great big Russian bear. Well, I'm sure Moscow would thank you very much for having that perspective. Because really, I tend to think, I mean, you know, hyenas and jackals, they're scary beasts, they have nasty snarls, but they're basically carrion eaters. They don't hunt, they will happily chew up whatever they can scavenge. And this, for me, I think has been part of, and I slightly hesitate to use the words, but the brilliance of Russia's approach. I mean, I think strategically it's disastrous. Tactically, it has been, in many ways, brilliant. They have managed to leverage what limited strengths they have to considerable advantage. But I said, I think it's important to stress just how limited those strengths are. I mean, this is a sort of about the most optimistic projection I could find. And I would stress that I specifically went for the most optimistic projection of Russian economic power. Because however much we might like to pretend that economics does not rule everything, the bottom line is that it does. Money is what feeds the sinews of war, money is what keeps populations happy, money is what allows states to assert authority over others. So at the moment we see Russia is there, an economy between the size of Italy and Brazil. I mean, under other circumstances, could we ever see Brazil challenging and reshaping the world order? Would we ever actually describe ourselves, and with apologies to I'm half Italian myself, so to my compatriots, you know, are we really that worried by the Italian war machine? No, of course not. The point is obviously that Russia leverages a much greater proportion of its resources in certain ways and uses them in certain ways. But the bottom line is that Russia's economy is relatively weak, and even by this particularly optimistic projection, that sees it sort of moving up the sort of chain, you know, still we're talking about something that is actually going to be between Brazil and Japan. Nothing like the economy of the European area, India, the United States, or China. This is a relatively poor country, which has massive demands. And as I said, I mean, I'm personally not an economist, but so therefore, you know, economists can bamboozle me with their realities. But talking to economists who I know, you know, most of them think this is much too generous to Russia. So they haven't got and they won't have the money. What about their military capacity? Well, as we know, Russia has been spending a lot on rearmament under Putin. Far more in many ways than Russia should be. They're not spending money on roads. They're not really spending money on education anymore. They're not spending money on healthcare. And let's face it, a lot more Russians die from bad healthcare than could possibly die from the evil Nazis of Ukraine. But that doesn't matter. This is a priority for kind of political and geostrategic reasons. And Russia has been spending a lot. There you are. It's third in that chain. But even so, I mean, it is much less than China, which is arming at a much more rapid and effective rate, let alone the gorilla in the room, which remains the United States. And what has that sustained defence spend bought? Well, as we saw in Crimea, it has bought soldiers who look modern and who seem to be able to sort of organise themselves effectively, have proper tactical communications and uniforms that sort of have all the necessary bits of modern stuff, from knee pads to eye protectors to ballistic helmets and such like. But we have to realise that what was deployed in Crimea was essentially the elite of the elite. These were Spetsnaz. These were naval infantry. What Russia really has now are two armies, I would suggest. It has built for itself quite an effective intervention force, and I'll come on to that later. But the bulk of its military is still relatively underdeveloped. Its level of operational effectiveness is distinctly limited. It still suffers from the usual Russian scourges of hazing, bullying, Didovshchina, indiscipline, certain degree of criminality. I mean, even according to the main military procurator, something like 20 to 25% of procurement spend disappears. Well, money doesn't just disappear, money gets stolen. There are still sort of massive challenges within the Russian military. So we shouldn't feel that what we saw in Crimea represents the new Russian military. It represents one of the two Russian militaries. So this is a force that has a large rump that is still essentially, in many ways, Soviet, despite the organisational changes that have taken place, and a smaller intervention force on which much more money has been lavished, that has a much greater proportion of professional volunteer forces instead of conscripts. You've got to remember, Russian conscripts are serving one-year terms, which means that they're really sort of usable for maybe 3 or at most 4 months of the year. And likewise, all the shiny equipment has gone to these intervention elements. So what about the political limits to Russian power? Well, I think they're quite striking. There is always this assumption that somehow Russians are different in that they're willing to accept whatever it takes in the name of Russian nationalism and Russian national pride. I mean, these are just sort of 3 statements that I've heard. Russians will endure any hardship for the motherland. The Russians are just simply brainwashed because of all the ludicrous propaganda that they see on television. And I have to say, from having gone through the brain-warping experience of watching Russian television in Russia for 7 months, absolutely. I mean, there is this bizarre parallel world that exists only on Russian television. And that Russians are more nationalist than anyone else. Well, I actually would question all of these things. First of all, today's Russians are not the Stalingrad generation. They have become used to a certain quality of life. Many, if not most of them, have travelled abroad. Even those who have not travelled abroad have a much, much greater sense of what life is like abroad. They watch foreign soap operas and movies. They have friends who have studied or travelled abroad. I mean, in many ways, one of the most corrosive long-term policies we ever can do against the Russian regime is to encourage student exchanges and foreign travel. The more they see what the West is like, the harder it is to mobilise them to support what Russia is now. And we also have to realise the extent to which the sort of massive willingness to endure hardships during World War II was because they had Stalin's terror state behind them. That actually, even if one looks at some, and I'm not for a minute trying to minimise the heroism of, for example, the defence of Leningrad, but nonetheless, one has to note the extent to which actually there was a massive political police repressive capacity there that was deployed to make sure that everyone fought on the barricades and so forth. Well, Russia today is authoritarian, but it is not a terrorist state. It cannot mobilize the same sort of level of fear to make people do things. Russians may watch the propaganda, they may well believe it on one level, but I think Russians are very used to being lied to by their state. They have been lied to, after all, for decades. They are able to, I think, detach and distinguish between the two. And I don't think they're more nationalist than anyone else. Again, I think this is part of the myth. It's interesting that, Crimea was a special case. No one I met had a bad thing to say about taking Crimea. But if one looks at what's going on in eastern Ukraine, even while, the opinion polls show this time and again, even while they believe that Kiev is bad and that poor ethnic Russian speakers were being exploited and put under threat in eastern Ukraine, it's still only a minority that would for a moment sanction military action there. It's only a minority that are willing to see their boys coming home in zinc boxes in order to preserve what's taking place in eastern Ukraine. There is not, in my opinion, a groundswell of public opinion for a prolonged conflict, let alone a military conflict, with the West or the outside world. And one has to think, well, okay, well, who are their friends? China? We can look at the gas deal that was concluded with China. Putin needed that gas deal. The Chinese knew that full well, and they exploited that leverage to the fullest. The Chinese are not, regardless of what Putin would like to think, Russia's allies. Today, the Chinese are Russia's loan sharks, offering credits at the best terms they can possibly gouge, basically to exploit the Russians in their time of need. These are not long-term friends. So who else have we got? Well, Iran. Again, the Iranians are happy to capitalize on Russia's willingness to sometimes support them or at least protect them, just simply as a way of getting at the United States. But it's hard to see there being any kind of long-term enthusiasm. Venezuela, well, good luck to you if you really want to rely on Venezuela as your great strategic ally. Syria? Belarus? I mean, come on, who are the Russians' friends? Who are the Russians' allies? No one. Russia essentially does stand largely alone. So it doesn't even have what we might think of as a sort of geopolitical muscle. So instead, it's turned to how it can leverage what capacities it does have. And on one level, this is nothing new. I mean, one can track back Russia's activities and everything from the Mongol arts of war and espionage. And the Mongols, after all, were phenomenally capable in undermining the enemies that they were later on going to attack militarily. One can look at the sort of the Tsarist great game as Tsarist Russia fought this covert war against Imperial Britain in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, in northern India. One can look at the Soviet active measures with which they tried to sort of destabilize regimes that were opposed to it and supportive of the West, the covert and proxy operations of the Cold War, modern information warfare. All of this is new. Sorry, is familiar. But what I would say is new is precisely the purposeful way that Russia has brought together all these tactics. I mean, if one looks at, for example, the sort of Tsarist tactics, these were typically ad hoc. These were carried out in a particular theatre of operations because a particular local governor or proconsul had a smart idea and was happy to apply it. There was no grand doctrine of destabilizing regimes that were supportive of the British or whatever. Likewise, something that was different about Soviet active measures is, and this is something I'll come to in a moment, is the extent to which actually the Soviets had an ideology. It was a self-serving ideology that was applied by a communist party that was largely made up of cynical careerists. But nonetheless, it was a genuine ideology. This is not the case now. There is no real ideological basis to it. I mean, the Soviets would sometimes do things which were practically inefficient in the name of ideology. For example, in the Spanish Civil War, the extent to which actually they turned on and devoured their allies because their allies were politically suspect. Rather than just thinking, look, our aim is to fight Franco's forces, and it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you're on my side. Modern Russia is far, far more cynical and pragmatic than the Soviets ever were, and by God, that's saying quite a bit. So I think what's different is actually precisely how today's Russia brings together a lot of existing ideas and disciplines and has a much more purposeful, thoughtful approach to it. And it very much, therefore, looks to thinking how it can basically put those together. And these, I would suggest, are sort of some of the key sort of elements. Russia's great strength is breaking the rules. Rules that we feel bound by. Russia does not. Now, okay, in the long term, that's problematic, because we begin to start thinking of Russia as a potential rogue state. But up to that point, it's actually very effective. Calibration of provocation. Again, this is something that is clearly tremendously current when we think of NATO and Article 5 and so forth. The Russians are very clearly building a whole strategy on the basis of, well, how can one operate below the threshold that will trigger the kind of response that the Russians don't want. Classic example was in the Crimea, when you saw these Russians without insignia going out and seizing locations and blockading Ukrainian military units. Now, they were patently Russian forces, even while Moscow said, oh, absolutely not, they're just people who buy their army surplus from local stores and things. Well, trust me, I actually looked around a whole bunch of Russian army surplus stores in Moscow, and I couldn't find Ratnik latest generation camouflage kit available. But the point is, it created this uncertainty in the West. Surely they wouldn't just be flat out lying to us. Surely there has to be some other potential explanation. Are these mercenaries? Is this some kind of unsanctioned operation being carried out by the Black Sea Fleet Command rather than ordered by Moscow? All kinds of different possibilities were being discussed. And that was crucial because it gave Moscow the few hours it needed to essentially seize the salient locations within the Crimea, to basically make its annexation of the Crimea a done deal. So in this respect, they calibrated the provocation. If it had just simply been the case of Russian troops openly rolling into Crimea, there would have been the chance that it would have first of all galvanized Kiev into fighting for the Crimea. And let's be honest, its decision not to fight for Crimea was disastrous. If it had fought for Crimea, it quite possibly would not be fighting currently in Donetsk and Luhansk. But that's a separate issue. But also, it meant that the West, at that key moment, was uncertain as to how to respond. And Moscow was therefore able to basically present the West with a fait accompli. The role of the security agencies, very important, the extent to which actually the intelligence and security apparatus is thoroughly and comprehensively integrated into Russia's way of war. They are not separate agencies. They are absolutely sort of central to it. The notion of you have all arms active measures, by which I mean that you very much calibrate, or coordinate rather, military operations, intelligence operations, economic operations, propaganda operations, all of these together. Which again is the Western ideal, but the West tends not actually yet to be very good at that. Well, I think the Russians have worked out how to do it much more effectively. And we've seen this in what doesn't yet have a title. I called it the Gerasimov Doctrine. Last year, this very interesting article that emerged in what is not usually the most interesting of journals, the Military Economic Courier, in which, ostensibly talking about the Arab Spring operations, the Chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov, who was one of the smartest and most thoughtful individuals, I would say, currently in the senior Russian military hierarchy, pointing out the extent to which in modern war, non-kinetic, non-military means can sometimes be much more effective than the military means. Now, there are many military people in the audience, but my experience is that on the whole, people in uniform usually don't want to admit that their men and guns might not be the deciding factors. So I think it is quite striking the extent to which actually this is someone who is thinking of precisely of non-military means as part of a war-fighting strategy. And that is important. So what are Russia's strengths? Let me just very briefly sort of zip through this. I mean, there's a belief that it lacks a stake in the status quo. It is willing to break the rules because it doesn't really think that the rules ultimately help it. Anything that destabilizes the current sort of international regimes, it thinks work to its advantage. It has intelligence power. This is one area that actually Russia does genuinely have, in my opinion, objective and relative strengths. Its intelligence apparatus, the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, GRU, military intelligence, and the FSB, the Federal Security Service, which is notionally domestic security, but in practice actually also operates internationally. These have for years been ramping up the scale, the scope, the tempo of their operations. They are a genuine Russian strength. Special operations and power projection, again, as we saw in Crimea. This is that sort of that first army, the good army. There's the VDV, the paratroopers, 4 divisions and 5 brigades, the naval infantry, 4 brigades, 3 battalions, the Spetsnaz, special forces, 8 brigades, a regiment, and so forth. I won't go through the full list. But I would mention that Special Operations Center. Most Spetsnaz are not true special forces of the sort that we might think of as the United States Special Operations Command, British SAS, or whatever. They're not Tier 1. In part because, if nothing else, a fair number of them are still conscripts and so forth. They're more like, say, the French Foreign Legion. They are an effective intervention force, a light infantry force. But with the creation of the Special Operations Center, which has basically had its baptism of fire in Crimea, the Russians have actually built a genuine Tier 1 special forces capacity. They have about 500 operators within it. And this is something new. These are really the people with the skills and the finesse to be able to carry out the most complex operations. And then there are other sort of Spetsnaz groups. The FSB had anti-terrorist commandos, the SVR has a group called Zaslon, and so forth. It's hard to really sort of pin some kind of a figure, but I would say we're talking about 120,000 deployable intervention forces that are pretty much close to solid Western standards. Its other strengths, it's political. This is an authoritarian regime. As you can see, this is not a man who has to worry about, at the moment at least, public opinion. This is not a man who has to worry about what his legislature is going to say. This is not a man who has to worry about pressures on the budget until the pressures become far too great. Russia can control the message. This is still a country which has managed to reclaim control, particularly of television and the other airways. And it uses its media in the rest of the world as an active disinformation, misinformation tool in order precisely to create division, create uncertainty in the West. To this end, it also acquires all kinds of strange bedfellows. And again, this is a reflection of the essential cynicism of Russian strategy. But whether it's Occupy Wall Street, whether it's figures such as Marine Le Pen in France, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, even the ultra-conservative figure Pat Buchanan, who once said, Putin may be one of us because of his conservative social policies on issues such as abortion and so forth. They're very happy to encourage a whole variety of different agents. Anyone really who might help divide the West. I mean, although clearly the overwhelming majority of environmentalists are just genuine committed citizens, there has been fairly conclusive evidence that Russian intelligence agencies have provided funding for environmentalists who are basically trying to campaign against fracking, which is a sort of a strategy, after all, that would reduce Europe's dependence upon Russian energy supplies. We have seen Russia advancing sort of a whole variety, or supporting a whole variety of right-wing anti-EU bodies and agencies such as Jobbik in Hungary and such like. Again, not because it really believes in them or cares about them, but because anything to help divide the West. And our weaknesses are crucial advantages for the Russians. Our sense that we must follow the rules. The fact that we are divided. The fact that also that Russia is not a priority. The West is very important for Russia. Russia is not always very important for the West. Now, clearly, at this time and in this place, Russia looms heavily. But on the other hand, if you're in Washington, actually China, Ebola, the dysfunctions of the American political system. You know, all of these things are much, much more immediate and salient than what might be happening in Moscow. And Russia benefits from that, and the result is that we don't have a strategy. We don't really have tactics. We don't even have a mechanism for how to use the fact that we are economically, politically, militarily, in almost every single basis, we are stronger. We just don't know how to use that strength. And so this is, for me, the new geopolitics. It's not a Cold War. It's not a time in which actually we need to worry about some grand competition for the world. This is practical rather than ideological. Putin does not want to convert the world in a way that the Soviets did. He does not care whether or not the British are Russian Orthodox. He does not care about what social policies the French have or whatever. He does not want to export Russian values. He wants, as he was regarded, to protect Russian values. This is an era of alternative warfighting tools. Sanctions. You know, we must not pretend that sanctions are anything other than economic warfare. We are at war with Russia. We just happen to be at war or with economic tools that play to our strengths, which for me is a plus. The aim is not to convert, but to neutralize the opponent, to prevent the other side from stopping you doing what you want to do. And therefore, you know, I would suggest that we face a future, and I think this is going to be for a while the new normal, which is about competition combined with grudging coexistence. We should not pretend that the Russians are our enemies in every respect. There is still cooperation taking place, and there can still be cooperation taking place. But the point is that competition will often overtake that. Russia will be an insurgent power. Its key strength is not to basically force us to do things, but to create inconveniences that make us want to cut a deal with the Russians. That's how Russia is operating. It basically creates messes, creates trouble, and then turns along and says, you seem to be having some trouble. I could make that go away, but what's the deal that you're going to offer? And you know, we see that in all kinds of contexts. We saw that with Syria. That in many ways, you know, Russia was very willing to basically support the regime in Damascus, not really because it had any great sympathy for the regime, but because precisely by supporting that, it gave the West a reason to basically try and buy it off. We've seen that with Iran. Again, no real love lost there, but it's more or less saying, I mean, and from time to time the West has given Moscow good deals, and Moscow has pulled back from its support for Iranian nuclear programs. It has pulled back from its commitment to sell the Iranians top-level surface-to-air missiles and so forth. But each time it's that sense of the West, look, make it worth my while, and I can make things more easy for you. The Arctic, in my opinion, is going to be another area in which actually already the Russians are building up a military capacity. Not because they're going to occupy the Arctic, how do you occupy shrinking ice cap, but instead to deny the Arctic and the opportunities for exploitation, for trade through it and such like. And that's why Ukraine is so important as a test case in precisely this business of just stirring up trouble and hoping that someone will make you a deal in order to change that. And to this end, actually, Russia does have, in my opinion, a defensive agenda. Now, it uses thoroughly offensive tactics in doing so. But basically, Putin wants to be left alone. Putin wants to be left alone. Unfortunately, we can't do that. Because the sorts of things that Putin demands are terms that would more or less write off huge portions of Eurasia to Russian influence, and would also involve us basically having to turn our backs on fundamental principles of international law. So, this is for me the future. That we can see, at least for while Putin is around, this hot piece, this kind of guerrilla geopolitics as being the new normal. Even if Ukraine gets sorted out next month, which alas, it doesn't look likely, but even if that happens, that's fine, it will have addressed one specific issue. But it will not, in my opinion, change the fundamental divergence of interests between the West and Russia. Russia cannot beat the West. We're too strong. What we can do, though, is to fail. We can fail to constrain Russia. We can fail to prevent Russia from dividing us, from distracting us, from demoralizing us. But anyway, it's for us to lose. In the long term, I do believe that this strategy is going to doom Putin's regime. I think that the crucial issue will be the economic one. I think it will lead to increasing divisions and dismay within the Russian elite. And if I had to make a prediction, I would say the first kind of potential crisis point is going to be late 2016. After parliamentary elections, which, although they're going to massage the results, but nonetheless, if they go badly, that might have the elite thinking that it's time Putin has to go. But the point is, the end game is going to be potentially messy. A Putin who feels assailed has very little interest and very little reason not to strike back, not to become increasingly problematic. I mean, if, for example, we continue to ratchet up sanctions, which is a policy that I would support personally, but nonetheless, and if that begins to have serious economic and thus political impact, Putin is going to be tempted to try and find other places where he can put pressure. And maybe that will mean stirring up Russian-speaking minorities in the Baltic. Maybe that will mean leaning on Moldova, now that Moldova is now looking much more clearly and directly towards the European Union. It will be essentially opportunistic. There is not, in my opinion, a grand strategy, but rather an opportunistic application of this new doctrine. But the thing is, in the short term, Putin will ratchet up the pressure. And if he does that, that will be uncomfortable, but that is actually a sign that we're winning. And so on that, hopefully kind of positive note, I will stop for the moment. And as I said, I would very much like to throw this open to question, discussion, disagreement, or whatever.